Public school education is the largest part of the state budget, receiving more than 40% of the state's general fund dollars. Recent funding has approached $50 billion a year, and with that, new approaches to improve K-12 education in California. Is all that money and all those changes having the desired effect, making California children smarter and better prepared for the future? We'll ask noted education policy expert Laura Hill with the Nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California, and we'll discuss the politics of education with Dan Walters of CalMatters. California's educational reforms, are they making the grade?
Additional funding for the Maddy report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. Chevron's Coalinga oil field and Fresno County have been doing side by side for over 100 years. Learn more at doers.com. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. In the last few years, there have been a flurry of educational reforms in California, and the state's public school districts continue to deal with these major changes in the way K-12 education is being delivered, assessed, and funded. How's it working out? Our guest is Laura Hill, an education expert with the Nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thanks very much.
So can you give us a little background on K-12 education in California? You know, how many students, what proportion are economically disadvantaged or English learners, and how do those numbers compare nationwide?
Sure. So California has about 6.2 million children in the K-12 system, the public system. And more than half of our students are economically disadvantaged. That's about 3.6 million, 58% overall. Nationally, about half of students fall into that economically disadvantaged category. And
so we're a little higher.
We're a little higher, yep. And we're definitely higher on the English learner front as well. So in California, we have about 1.3 million English learners. That's nearly a quarter of our student population. And nationally, that number is about 1 in 10.
Wow, so it's about 25% versus 10%. That's another really big difference.
That's a much bigger difference.
Yeah. So the state's approach to K-12 education has changed in a lot of ways. So let's kind of talk about some of those. For example, how money is allocated, local control funding formula. What's that all about?
So prior to this big shift for the change to the local control funding formula, most of the dollars flowed to districts in categorical grants. And we started...
Categorical grants are money where you say, I'm going to give you money, but it's for this specific thing.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yes. So we had buckets for English learner children. We had buckets for economically disadvantaged.
Buckets is a great way to describe it. Here's a bucket of cash to do this, do this.
Take it and do that with those kids, and then you tell us exactly how you spent the money. We may not be so worried about the outcomes, but we want to know how you spent it. And this shift really changed the way that the dollars flow to the district and gives districts a lot more flexibility in how they spend the money. And the idea being that districts have more control. They know what to do for their students, and the outcomes will improve.
And there's also been changes in the federal education law. This Every Student Succeeds Act that was passed under Obama, Common Core, those kinds of things too. Let's talk about the federal law first, the Every Student Succeeds Act. What's that all about?
That's one I'm not as well versed on.
I think the focus there is accountability.
It is accountability, and I think that the main impact for California is figuring out how we're going to accommodate their accountability.
You know, one of the things though, it's he who has the gold makes the rules, right? And so there's a lot of money flowing from the state to the local districts,
That's right.
But the federal government not so much.
Yep.
So yeah, this law exists, but I think it's $28 million. It sounds like a lot of money, but the
it's
reality
much smaller.
is, it's much smaller.
And then you know what we've done with the local control funding formula is given districts more control. They have their own ways of accounting for how the money is spent. There are state priorities for accountability measures, and districts have some of their own also. Now these things kind of have to come into alignment. That's the main impact from ESSA.
Right. And we've also got the Common Core.
That's right.
What's that all about?
So it's not a prescribed curriculum. It's something that the state opted into along with a lot of other states. The idea is that now there are standards that are expected at each grade level for math and English language arts. And this is all about getting students college and career ready. But it's up to states and districts and teachers to figure out how to implement those. We have guidance.
But this wasn't a federal thing. This was actually governors got together and decided what this was going to be.
There were incentives from the federal government, but states opted in.
So have all these reforms improved performance? What grade would you assign all these educational reforms? A passing grade, not passing?
Incomplete? It's not very satisfying for me to tell you this, but I think it's sort of too soon to say in many ways because there have been so many changes with the change in the funding formula, the way that districts now have more control, the emphases that they are to be placing on English learners and economically disadvantaged students. We've changed the curriculum, we've changed the testing. We've only been using this new test for 3 years. The first year where we could measure change started in 15, and we looked at 16, there was a lot of growth on the first year of the test. 17 results have just come out, pretty flat. So
needs a longer trend line, maybe.
Yeah, I think we need a longer trend line. I don't think people are going to be satisfied with the last year.
Let me ask you this last question in this segment, and that is high need students. I mean, the focus on a lot of this is low income English learners, foster youth, others. Has that an impact there? Is it close the achievement gap?
So the good news was in the first year that everyone did somewhat better, and maybe economically disadvantaged students did a little bit better than the average student. So there's a very tiny narrowing of the gap in the second year of testing, so we could see growth with the first year. Last year, there really wasn't much change at all.
So again, we have to kind of wait and see. Yeah. Well, up next, we're going to talk about some of the new challenges created by the state's educational reforms. What are they? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. You know, the state's raft of educational reforms have created new challenges for local school districts. What are they, and how are they coping with those situations? Our guest is Laura Hill, an education expert with the nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California. So there's been a lot of talk about Common Core. Any parent who has a kid in school has heard about this. How's the implementation been going?
Well, I think the results in the early years are sort of mixed. I think there was a lot of concern about how it was going to go with everything from, how are we going to change the way we're teaching? How are we going to actually administer this assessment that now is going to rely on computers when we haven't been doing that before? Are we going to even have the bandwidth at our schools to do it? So those were some of the early concerns, and some of those early concerns are kind of over. We're still deep in the implementation phase.
Yeah, it's interesting. They have books and stuff that had to kind of match up with what the Common Core was, and the tests had to match up. There was a kind of a shakeout period going on there,
right,
for a while. I want to ask you about, you were talking earlier about the local control funding formula, where they changed from categoricals, buckets of money, I think you described it as, to a situation where here's the money, use it the best way you see fit. Can you explain how that process has worked? How is it being implemented at the local level?
So it started in about 2013, and the idea was that we kind of would be able to tell at the district level what the ultimate dollar amount was going to be for the district, because it's based on counts of students and the share of your students that are high needs, but it's been being implemented over many years, and the goal was to have it be complete by 2021. We're ahead of schedule because the economy's been doing better. But what I'd like to do is give an example, I think, of how it works. So if you've got two school districts that are similar sizes, they can end up with very different funding streams from the local control funding formula depending on the population that they serve. So for example, we've got Fremont Unified and Stockton Unified. They each have about the same number of students, about 35,000. So that means that the main grant that they get is the base grant.
So the base grant, they both get that?
They both get that, and they get it it's about $7,000 a kid. Okay. So they end up with, I think, about $260 million each from the base grant.
But $7,000 a kid is kind of your starting point.
That's your basic starting point. There's some modifications, but that's basically it. And then all school districts that have any high-need students, and high-need students are English learners, foster youth, economically disadvantaged.
People that you would expect that might need a little more attention.
That's right. Okay. Each child generates 20% more on top of the base grant for those two districts.
A little bonus.
A little bonus, a supplemental grant.
Okay.
So Fremont has 31% of its students that are high needs. Stockton Unified's got 86%. Big difference in this in the student need there. So Fremont gets about $17 million from this grant, and Stockton gets about $45 million.
Wow, that is
difference.
A huge difference.
And then there's the concentration grant. So districts...
Another
grant.
Another level, okay.
So districts that serve more than 55% of their population is high needs qualify for the concentration grant for their students.
So it's a little more money, and that's by district, not by school.
That's right. None of this is by school.
Okay.
So Stockton Unified gets an additional $41 million from the concentration grant, and Fremont gets nothing because they serve 31%. Wow. So, but that's all based on need. So you just end up with similar counts of students with very different
one's approaching $90 million, the other is $17 or $18 million, quite a big difference in that extra money.
In the extra part, that's right.
And the idea there is, again, to help those districts that have a lot of students who maybe need more attention.
Exactly.
That's the idea behind it. So you've noted that the fiscal picture for K-12 education has improved, but more work needs to be done. What are some of the things that still need attention?
Well, one central question that we really didn't answer with the local control funding formula is how much money is actually enough. So we're really back to where we were prior to the recession in terms of the outflow of dollars from the state to districts. We've moved it around. We're catching up to where we were. We had a period of not having anything like what we were used to. But we haven't really been able to answer the question of, is this the right amount or the right blend?
Because there was money coming in, then was the Great Recession, real reduction, and so now there's more money, but we're trying to get back to where we were.
We're back there, but is that, would we say, prior to the recession that was really enough money for education? So that's one big question.
What about special ed? What are the issues there?
Well, special education was left out of the local control funding formula. Special education is different in many ways. It's not integrated with the general education in both in the finances and in accountability. So there was a task force a few years ago. We did some work on the idea of what would it look like if we could integrate, would we be able to improve accountability and hopefully outcomes for students with disabilities and bring the funding stream into the local control funding formula.
What about, I think you mentioned the state's educational data system and the situation there. Good, bad, needs improvement?
We have great data, but most people who might be able to use it don't have access to it. So the K-12 system has great data, and then each of the institutions of higher ed have great data. They are not connected unless you're working with special arrangements.
They've got to talk to each other.
They've got to talk to each other and let people help them do some research with it.
All right. Well, up next, we're going to talk about charter schools. Are they the answer? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. Since their inception 20 years ago, charter schools have become a significant part of the California public school system. These quasi-independent, publicly funded schools educate about 10% of the state's students. How have they fared? Have they fared better or worse than traditional schools under these new educational reforms? We're talking with Laura Hill with the Nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California. So there may be assumption by some that that only rich white suburban kids attend charter schools. Who actually attends charter schools in California?
Definitely some of those children, but also African American students are slightly overrepresented in the charter school population. And when we look at sort of the distribution of high needs students across charters and traditional public schools, we see at the very high end, so like schools that are 90% high needs or more, charter schools and traditional public schools look pretty similar in terms of, they're both represented in that group.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you've done a comprehensive review of charter schools and how they're being treated under the local control funding formula. What were your findings?
Well, one finding of ours that was well known to be kind of a fact, but we just kind of went into a little bit more detail, is that they're treated differently in terms of the way one of the parts of the local control funding formula works. So we just were discussing the base grant and the supplemental grant, and then there's the concentration grant, which is the one that is for districts that are serving.
So just to go over, and there's three parts then to that funding.
Right.
Okay.
Three parts of the funding. So in terms of the two main parts, the supplemental and the base, charters and traditional public schools are treated in the same ways.
Okay. So it's the concentration factor.
The concentration factor that differs for charter schools. So what happens is the amount of the concentration grant that a charter school can get depends on where it's located.
The district, right? Because it's not done at the school level.
That's right.
Right.
So
you could have a charter school that could have a lot of high need students, but they're not getting that concentration factor because the district overall doesn't have that concentration of high need students.
Exactly. So you can have two charter schools, one that's 90% high needs but happens to be in a 30% high needs district. It's not going to get the concentration grant at all, and another charter that's 90% in a 95% district, and it'll get all of its concentration grant.
Okay. So what's the rationale then for treating charter schools differently, and what are the implications?
Well, I think the main reason that went into place is that the legislators and policymakers were concerned that charter schools might come into being in order to kind of take advantage of the extra money that's available through the concentration grant, and that maybe districts would game it or that charter school organizations would game it. And a downside of allowing that to happen is that you increase segregation. So I think that was a concern that was on a lot of people's minds. You didn't want to create an incentive for the organizers to pull more money away and to pull the high needs children into one spot, because then you're taking them away from the potential benefit of being in mixed environments.
Yeah. So you suggest there's some downsides to this approach. Those and what other downsides? Any other downsides?
Well, the downsides to having this approach where you can't get that money is there are charter schools that are formed for the express purpose where the founders or the staff or whatever has as their mission they want to serve these children and they feel like they know how to do it.
Provide a different kind of way to teach and approach, because charter schools are a little bit, they aren't as regulated as a traditional school. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think there are some differences in those kinds of questions, but at the school site they might have more flexibility in trying to figure out how to serve a particular population. So, in some ways, that would discourage new ones from coming into being with that kind of purpose in mind.
And you don't want to discourage that. You want innovation and you want these charters to give them a chance to kind of do their thing.
I think you have to be mindful of both concerns. Right. Yeah, and so we were interested in understanding like how big is the scope of the problem, how many charter schools, for example, or students are impacted by this rule, and how big is that effect. And so it was sort of an accounting exercise in many ways, and we determined that on average, there are about a third of charter school students who are impacted by not having full access to the concentration grant, and that ended up being about $450 per pupil, which turns out to be about 20% of kind of the extra that you could get.
That's significant.
So for those students, that number can add up, and we did find that the more high needs your charter school is, the bigger this effect.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. So what impact is all this? You assume that more money leads to better performance.
Right.
Is that really true? And what effect has this had, this lower funding on some of the charter schools, on their performance?
So we were a bit surprised to see at this early look that we didn't find any outcomes related to having less funding.
So then maybe there isn't a correlation between money and outcome.
We want to say that in this situation that we feel like it's a little too soon to tell, because charter schools actually did a lot better when the local control funding formula was put into place. So there was a big kind of upswing in funding overall, and then some schools didn't get the full effect, so we're worried about that. But there are a couple of things that we couldn't investigate in this study. One is, if some of these schools that are having success despite not having all that funding, if there are extra sources of funding through private grants, for example. And another question is, you can't control for who selects into these schools. Right. So same example, you've got a charter school that has high need neighborhood and charter school with low need neighborhood. Who in the low need neighborhood is going to go search, or high need neighborhood is going to go search for the charter school? Maybe that charter school is really doing something good there.
That's interesting. And it's not unusual for the legislature to look to the PPIC for ideas for new legislation. So maybe we'll see a modification in some of the local control funding formulas that relates to charter schools. Well, up next, the politics of education reform. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. So what are the political implications of recent attempts at educational reform? We're joined by one of the most astute observers of state politics, Dan Walters from CalMatters. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you.
So, bottom line, what grade would you give California's attempts at educational reform?
Yeah, about a C.
A gentleman's C?
Yeah, a gentleman's C, I guess. So that sounds a little sexist, but yeah, a gentleman's C.
I'm sorry. I'm dating myself.
All right. Yeah, it's... they make a stab at it, but in the end, it doesn't matter how good the intentions are, or how sincere they are, or how much money you spend, or anything else. Those kind of metrics really pale in significance to, do they work?
Are they affecting the test scores?
Are you closing the achievement gap between white and Asian kids on one side, and Latino, Black, and poor kids of all races on the other side? And so far, there's no evidence that the achievement gap is being materially narrowed. And that's why you have to say C, because at least they recognize the problem, and they've kind of done what they think is something about it, but you really don't know whether it's working or whether it's just throwing money at a problem without any results.
Yeah, the state superintendent of schools is saying the tests are more difficult now, so we really can't tell. I guess we'll see over time whether there's a trend there or not. Let me ask you another question. You had actually written about this, about the later school start time. That was a discussion in the legislature this year. I think of particular interest to parents and students. That's one attention grabber for sure. But you said the legislature muffed this issue. Why do you say they muffed it?
Because they didn't do it. They didn't require school districts to start no later than 8:30 in the morning, even though all the studies by pediatric groups, doctors, everybody says that early start times hurt learning. because they run counter to the natural circadian rhythms of adolescence. Adolescents want to stay up late and get up later, and you say, well, I just make them go to bed earlier or something like that, which doesn't really work because it just doesn't mesh with adolescent circadian rhythms. And
that explains the physiology of teenagers.
Yeah, I mean, it's something in the vein. Later on, when you get older, like me, you wake up really early,
but you can't get to sleep or whatever.
Whatever. But the kids first of all, kids need more sleep. They're sleep deprived. Right. They're not getting, however you measure it, they're not getting enough sleep. The legislature could have done something about it. They dictate all sorts of other health and safety requirements having to do with school children, and they could have done this, and so I say they muffed it.
It's interesting that the RAND Corporation did a study, and they found that if California did change to 8:30 in the morning as a start time, that would contribute $10.2 billion to California's economy within 10 years and almost $25 billion in 20 years. So there's an economic reason you might want to do it.
There are some economic reasons, but mostly it's because, hey, the idea of an education system is to educate kids, and anything that is an impediment to that should be attacked.
You can take that money and put it back into education. Let me ask you another question. You've written about California's response to the federal school accountability law signed by President Obama, and you're saying California's response has fallen short. How so?
Well, California didn't really want to do what the Obama-era school law says, which is to identify poor performing schools and demonstrate what you're doing about them. The whole thrust of the state's, quote, accountability, and I put that in quotes, program, is to not do that. It is to have they're supposed to be fixing the schools, not trying to hammer people who are poorly performing. Now, the federal school law is less draconian than the old federal school law, but nevertheless, it does have this stuff. So the educational reform and civil rights groups, the what's called Equity Coalition, has been very critical of the state for its kind of fill in the blanks, don't do anything extra sort of a response to the federal requirements, and they may take their plea to Washington and see if they can get the Trump administration to crack down on California. This would be a strange thing for the ACLU to go to Washington and ask Trump to do something, but it could happen.
That would get some press, but Jerry Brown's all about subsidiarity?
Subsidiarity.
Subsidiarity, I'm sorry. Pushing it down to the local level, and so it's kind of a minimalist approach, I guess, they're taking with this money. Let me ask you another question, though, about educational reform and the Trump administration, now that we're talking about it. Usually there's conflict, it seems, between what the federal policy is and what the state policy is in this current administration. Do you see that happening also in education?
Well, it is happening in education, although oddly enough, they were very much at odds with the Obama people on the earlier incarnation of federal school law. You have to also remember that these federal school laws only have penalties that attach themselves to federal funds, which are a very small part of this revenue stream to schools. So they could thumb their noses at the federal government and just forego the money and say, do what you will, we're going to go our own way. And I think they're kind of daring the Trump administration to cut them off for being unresponsive to the federal system, and it is another point of conflict between Trump and California.
I guess we're going to see. I want to thank Dan Walters from CalMatters for joining us, also Laura Hill from the Public Policy Institute of California. If you want to stay up with state and local politics, you can follow us on Facebook or on Twitter, or log on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.